and before that as education editor. And now I work for the Centre for Homelessness Impact, which seeks to use evidence and data to bring an end to homelessness. We have a great panel today. We are joined by Edward Timpson, Conservative MP and former Minister for Children and Families, who is a co-chair of the Commission. We're joined by Sharon Hodgson, the other co-chair, who was, among her many shadow roles, spokesman for Labour for Children and Families, and is now Parliamentary Private Secretary to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. We have Robert Halfon, another former minister at the Department for Education, who is now chair of the Commons Education Select Committee. And we have Kate Green, who is Labour's Shadow Education Secretary. We will hear from each of the panelists in turn, and after their introductory remarks, we want to hear from you, the audience. So please do use the Q&A function to put your questions to the panel, and then I'll call them out after the opening remark. I'll pick them out and put them to the panel. Please also join in on social media. The hashtag for the event is Early Years Manifesto. And so before we begin with our panelists, I just want to say one set of remarks, and my point is about cross-party agreement. Now, our politics is adversarial, and necessarily so. It's important we have competing political parties who put different ideas and visions to the electorate. That is democracy. But in my 34 years as a journalist, I saw there are some issues, particularly on social policy, where it's impossible to get lasting, meaningful change within the course of one parliament. And for these, you really need cross-party agreement. One of these certainly is homelessness, the field in which I now work, and housing more generally. Another is social care reform, which Boris Johnson's government is still grappling with, as many governments before have done. But I think that early years education and support certainly comes into this category. And that's why I commend the commissioners who are behind this report, and particularly the co-chairs, Edward Timpson and Sharon Hodgson, from different political parties, who've come together to draw up a joint manifesto on ways to invest meaningfully for the long term in early years education. And I commend to Kindred Squared, the charitable foundation for early years, which has supported this initiative. The report makes fascinating and grim reading, and I'll just pick out a couple of points from it. It tells us there are 2 million families with children under 5 who are living in poverty, and poverty is rising fastest for the youngest children. It tells us that at just 3 years old, a child growing up in poverty is nearly 1.5 years behind their more affluent peers when it comes to early language development. And we don't see an even picture across the country. A child who qualifies for free school meals due to low family income in London is 30% more likely to reach the expected standard at the end of reception than a child in Leeds, in Greater Manchester, or Merseyside. So this report says we must invest effectively in early years education, in children's centres and in family hubs. And so that's why I'm delighted to be here today and chair this event. So that's enough from me. I'd now like to invite our first speaker, Edward Timpson MP, to address you.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg, for that introduction and giving I think a good way of introducing what is the heart of this commission and the work that we've done. And I just want to put on record my thanks to the Centre for Social Justice and the Fabian Society for supporting Sharon and I, along with all the commissioners who've given their expertise, their thoughts, and their ideas about how we can take this forward across the political spectrum, as well as Rob Halfon and Kate Green for joining us today, I think, which demonstrates that although, as you alluded to, Greg, we come from different sides of the political spectrum, I think what binds us is a belief that these early years of a child's life really are absolutely critical, and we should do everything we can with our collective wisdom, if that's what we have, to come up with something that can endure beyond different parliaments and different governments. A decade and beyond is what we hope to achieve through some of the recommendations that we've made. in this report. And I know from my own background with a family who fostered for 30 years and growing up with many children who had some of the very worst starts in life, just how important these early years are and that we get them right. And I still have a 4-year-old of my own who's also had to endure, like many small children, the last 18 months of being away from their friends, from that social contact interaction, and many of the ways that they will develop in a healthy way, both in the home but also outside of the home. And so that makes it even more sort of time sensitive that we really make some strides for those children who are falling further behind. And that's really at the heart of this review and this manifesto, is really understanding why it is that there are still some children that remain far behind their peers even before they start school. And I think this is a really timely point for us to be putting this manifesto out there. We've had the Ledson review into the 0 to 2-year-olds. Both Sharon and I were involved in helping draw that together. And this really has many of the same aspects and chimes with many of those recommendations, although our remit is from 0 to 5. That's the focus that we've had, and we've tried to make sure that we reflect that in the different recommendations that we've made. And within that, we've got really 3 sort of core asks or elements to this manifesto. The first is about making young children really a priority for our society. And we know that although there is understandably a lot of time and effort put on ensuring that we have great schools in this country and education is at the forefront, responsible investment now in a child's early years will avoid costs much later. And it's making sure that we don't lose the early years in the conversation we have about giving the best start in life for every child. And it was very revealing to see the response from the YouGov survey that was done for this manifesto into the perception amongst the public as to where early years fell within priorities during the pandemic. And of course, it was, I think, only 1% felt it was at the forefront, which demonstrates how much work that we have to do. But beyond making children the priority, young children the priority in society, regardless of their circumstances based on need, we've also wanted to look into the dynamic within the home as well as within the community. And that's reflected in many of the recommendations, the short-term and the long-term ones that we've made. So it's about supporting parents to make sure that their homes are a nurturing and safe environment for children. It's about giving parents time away from work sometimes in order to form those really important, strong attachments and bonds with their children in those formative years. It's about giving them financial stability to focus on children and not see that as a difficulty in trying to make it happen in the right way. And also about what's out there for them in the community, professional support, how we bind that together much more cohesively and coherently with freer and easier access for parents as and when they need it. As I say, much of this does chime with the Ledson review, but there is a huge amount of scope here to go further and demonstrate that across parties, we really want to put children at the heart of our communities, our policies and our politics. And although we're not necessarily a political platform today, it is a policy platform that we are all agreed on, and one that I hope that we can all take forward together in the months and years ahead. It should be at the real centre of the levelling up agenda as we talk about. It's not just about infrastructure, as important that is, it's also about human development, particularly children. And for me and for the colleagues and the commissioners on this review and who've been involved in putting this manifesto together, that will be our relentless pursuit, not during this Parliament, but I hope in ones to come in the future. So on that, Greg, I'll hand over to my co-chair, Sharon.
Thank you. Sharon, please address the panel.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here this morning, having worked on this commission with Ed and the commissioners for over 16 months, right throughout the pandemic. So it was all done virtually. I would first like to start by thanking the Fabian Society and the Centre for Social Justice and of course my wonderful co-chair Edward Timpson for their cooperation and goodwill, without which this important manifesto could never have happened. So when the idea for back in the day for Sure Start Centres was first conceived, Tessa Jowell, the lovely late Tessa Jowell, said she wanted to fling open those breeze-blocked 90s doors and smell the babies. And people who work in early years or have family of their own will know exactly what that means. And Tessa was successful in that. But our babies are so much more than just their smell or that small space that they occupy. They radiate out into our communities with their sounds and their lovely smells. And we are reminded that each child deserves to live their life to the fullest. And Tessa wanted Sure Start Centres to be more than box-ticking exercises. They were made to knit the fabric of communities together. Yet since 2010, these centres have sadly not been protected by government, and over 1,000 closed, as we all know, and the rest were left with so little funding that they were shelves of their former selves. And while each child deserves a fair chance, too often they are held back by circumstances beyond their control. At 3 years old, a child growing up in poverty is nearly 1.5 times behind their more affluent peers in language development. And there are many other similar statistics and measures. And the inequality of birth is just huge. For instance, in Blackpool, a newborn can expect to live to 77, while a newborn in London, in parts of London, can expect to live as many as 5 years longer. And I've seen that statistic be up to 10 years, depending on, if you're doing parts of a city or a certain postcode, those comparisons. And it's this sort of divide, and I try not to say north-south divide. When I first came into politics, that obsessed me as, a northerner, which the accent might give away. But I'm aware that this happens within parts of London as well. All my London MP friends say that it isn't just a north-south divide. So I've campaigned to fix this. It's what drove me into politics, and it still does. As Labour MP, as a mother, as a former Shadow Minister for Children and Families, as a former nappy changer also, and hopefully a future nappy changer too, if grandkids ever come my way and my kids get their act together. So as I keep reminding them. So this manifesto offers, strong, concrete policies to arrest and reverse the decline in the nation's early years offer that has gone on for decades and decades. At the moment, 185,000 children start school every year unready to learn. And the coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated that problem, as we all know, and urgent reform is needed to prevent a lost generation. Young children must be our top priority for our whole society. And while this is and has been a cross-party effort, Labour particularly is committed to making the UK the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. I'm sure all on this call agree with that. But the government could start today. So I urge the government to heed our advice in this excellent report we've produced. And let's hear our babies' cries, let's rally to their needs and give them the best start that they all, each and every one of them, deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. So our next speaker is Robert Halfon. Robert.
Hello, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you to Edward, who's a friend and really was a superb children minister, and to Sharon, who I know well and does so much work on this, and to the Fabian Society, but particularly to the Centre for Social Justice, who I rely on and speak to almost on a weekly basis. So I think that they are one of the most important think tanks in the United Kingdom in terms of social justice issues. I've learned a lot I was previously skills minister, but I've learned a lot as chair of the Education Committee about early years, and everything I've learned has convinced me that you could solve almost every problem in education if you invest in early years. I mean, we know that, for example, by the time disadvantaged pupils reach GCSE, 16 years oh, they're 18 months behind their better off peers. And 40% of that attainment gap starts in early years. Our committee just published a report into the disadvantages faced by white working class boys and girls on free school meals. And in 2018-19, just 53% of free school meal eligible white pupils met the expected standard of development at the end of the early years foundation. And that's perhaps almost the lowest percentage for any disadvantaged ethnic group in our country. When we think that there are 900,000 white working class boys and girls on free school meals, that is a pretty grim statistic. I come to this not, there's arguments about how much the government should intervene in terms of these areas. And my philosophy is it's not about big government or small government, it's about a good government. And I just want to draw out a few things from the report. Health visits. I mean, I went to Manchester City Council to see what they do. They have health visits and checks. The report says that all children should receive 5 mandated health visits and checks. And in our select committee report on early years, which we published a couple of years ago, we said that the government should ensure that local authorities are collecting full and complete data on the number of home visitors and build on the evidence in Greater Manchester, where every child is assessed 8 times between 0 to 5 years old, including for speech and language development. And you document in the report that it makes a huge difference. The other thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we have a skilled workforce. And in the report, you talk a lot about raising skills of early education practitioners by investing in professional development and more funding for public, private, voluntary and independent early year settings. I'm glad that you mentioned apprenticeships, because what we said in our report, in our Education Committee report on this, was that the government should commission quality research on training provision and coaching for apprenticeships in childcare, as well as professional development for those already in the profession seeking to progress. And I think that apprenticeships are the answer to this, all the way through from level 2 right up to degree level. I think this should be a very good route to encourage people into early years training provision. And I'm glad that your report makes this recommendation. And we'll just Sharon mentioned family hubs. In our recent report on white working class boys and girls, we mentioned that there should be a family hub in every town. I congratulate not just the MPs on the panel today, but also people like Fiona Bruce, who have been battling day after day on this issue. And the family hubs are different from the Sure Start centres because they have a much more a one-stop shop for everything from mentoring to mental health to career advice to GPs on their outreach visits to people's homes. And I've seen it. We have one in my own constituency run by Essex Council and Virgin Healthcare, and the satisfaction surveys is enormous, and the difference they make to troubled families also makes a huge difference. And in terms of family hubs, what it needs to be linked to, when I went to Manchester, I also saw where a family hub was directly linked to a school, so it was like a feeder. And we had Feltham Reach Academy come to our select committee, and we said that they do a lot of work on parental engagement. And I think that if we can encourage schools and work on pilot schemes and look at models like the Feltham Reach Academy, troubled families, but particularly investing in early years. Your report says that the government should overhaul the early years funding model. That's important. I do think there should be a new funding settlement. In our select committee report, we suggested that there should be a review of 30 hours childcare policy. It's wrong to me. The government invested a lot in childcare, but it seems wrong to me that MPs who have children aged 3 to 4 can get 30 hours with MP wages, yet a single parent who's not able to work can only get 15 hours. Okay, there are extra things they can access, but the principle to me is wrong, and actually we need to relook at the whole funding regime, and that is important. The final thing I just want to say is, again, I mentioned at the beginning about it's not about big government or small government, it's about big government. And one of the unsung success stories is our maintained nursery system, that almost every single one of them is good or outstanding. They always live on, it seems to me, on not knowing when the next paycheck is going to be, substantial paycheck, and we need to sort out once and for all a long-term funding settlement. I mean, these are good institutions that are changing the lives of our children for the better, and to constantly have to each year kind of hope that the government gives them a certain amount of money, to me is wrong. Even though the government have coughed up recently, they need definitely a secure funding settlement so they can carry on the success that they've been able to achieve.
Thank you very much, Robert. Incidentally, Robert, the sound quality was a bit mixed with your comments. We did hear you, but it wasn't the best. So if there's anything you could tweak while we're hearing from our next speaker, that would be of great benefit. But I'm delighted now to welcome Kate Green, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Kate.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. And like all the other speakers, I'd like to start by thanking everyone involved in producing this manifesto, Kindred Squared for commissioning the work, the commissioners chaired excellently by Sharon and Edward, and the Centre for Social Justice, and particularly in my case, the Fabian Society as a past chair of the Society. I want to thank both those think tanks for the work that has been done to produce the underpinning research and analysis and draw the report together. And it's really great, I think, to be at an event that follows a report that have really shone a spotlight on the early years, a part of the education system that quite often does find itself overlooked and neglected, but which I completely agree with all the other speakers is the most important part of the way in which we support and invest in children's development and progress. And the investment we make in early years is going to pay the biggest dividends over the course of a child's childhood and life journey. We know that both early years provision and, of course, families and very young children have really taken quite a hit from the COVID pandemic. And it's very, very distressing to think what proportion of a very young child's life will have been lived under COVID and what that will have meant for some of those children in terms of their development and also their social well-being. And I was told a very, very touching story the other day by our colleague Baroness Glenys Thornton, who took her own grandchild to Hampton Court. And while they were there, they saw another little girl aged about 2 who was standing stock still, just looking at the other little children and occasionally putting her hand out and touching one, because all of her childhood really up until that point had been spent only with her family. She hadn't been able to interact with other children and other babies. And I think we need to remember how very, very important it is that children have that time from very early on with other young children. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why it's important, so very important, that we invest in good quality early years and childcare provision. But that sector has suffered from the COVID pandemic, and indeed, as Sharon was pointing out, was suffering anyway with the closure of 1,000 Sure Start centres over the last decade. And under COVID, we've seen, of course, a lot of pressure in the market on providers. We've seen 2,500 providers close their doors just since the beginning of this year. So clearly there is a lot of work to do to rebuild capacity and sustainable capacity in the sector. And I just wanted to pick up one thing that both Rob and Sharon touched on, which is about the role of provision of early years provision through family hubs or children's centres or Sure Start is, of course, about child development and well-being. It is, of course, about support for parents and families, but it has a wider community function too. And in my own constituency, I still see the legacy of the Sure Start centres, which we mostly don't have now, sadly, when among the mums who used those centres 15, 18 years ago, those mums, when the pandemic hit, were the bedrock of our mutual support groups in my constituency. They had all known each other for years. They'd been together as young mums with their kids. Even now, when their kids are off at university or working, those mums still form the nucleus of our community because they got to know one another together at the Sure Start when their children were very young. And they come from all sorts of different parts of our community, but they became used to working and being together. So I think there's something immensely important about the community element of what we offer in our early years settings and family centres. I also very much agree that in terms of funding, we need to make sure that early years secure their fair share of the funding. And that's why in our recently published Children's Education Recovery Plan, we've made a point of saying that there needs to be a boost to the early years pupil premium to bring it up to the same level as for primary children. And I also think there are some really important points in the manifesto about using rights at work in a way that enable parents to have more time to be at home enjoying time with their children. We know, and the manifesto points this out, that there's significant underuse of parental leave at the moment, and a significant proportion of fathers and mothers who are not eligible at all for that leave and miss out on that time with their children. And that's why I very much welcome the point in the manifesto of the need to overhaul the shared parental leave arrangements. And then the final thing I really wanted to say was about this point about the coherence of services, about bringing services together. Still today, we see far too much siloing between health, education, family support, housing support, the range of services that families need and want to access. I think that the way to respond to this is to put the child at the centre of the way that we imagine how these services work together, as we did with the Every Child Matters strategy, which I think commanded a lot of support, and I would like to see built back in a modern form for the next decade and future. And just to conclude, Greg, let me say that you began by saying you need cross-party working to make the big changes that are needed. You also need cross-party support to sustain and protect them into the future. I want to see the early years seen as an absolutely irreversible, integral part of our education system, of the support that we offer to families and children, irrespective of who is in government. That seems to me to require cross-party support, and that's why I think that the work that's been done through this commission is so important, and I welcome it.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to all our panel. We have some great questions coming in on the Q&A function. And remember, please do join in on social media with the hashtag Early Years Manifesto. Now, I want to get through as many of the audience questions as I can. So perhaps I'll ask panelists just in pairs and two at a time, and then we'll go to another question. Unless you really feel as a panelist you have something to say. So the first question I'm going to put to Sharon and then to Edward. It's put by Jeff Knott and is about adverse childhood experiences. And we have a couple of other questions on this subject before. He says there's no mention of adverse childhood experiences in the report. I'm not sure that's quite the case. I did see a reference, I think I remember. But Jeff Knott says there should be a policy of mandating trauma-informed practices in agencies such as schools, the police, GPs, local authorities, and of making parents aware of the effects of adverse childhood experiences in order to avoid them. Sharon, what do you think about the critical and importance of understanding the impact of adverse childhood experiences?
I mean, it's vitally important that everyone understands that. And, you know, there's been so much work done already by the Wave Trust, by the Adverse Childhood Experiences All-Party Group that I'm a member of, and I'm sure Edward is, the group's chaired by Tim Lawton. And a lot of that went into the report that was produced for the government by Andrea Leadsom as well. And there was an amazing manifesto done back in, oh gosh, was it 2015? We did a whole report by the, on ACEs, by the Wave Trust, for the first 1001 critical days. So it's not that we were sort of ignoring that work. And as you say, we will have touched upon it, we will have mentioned it, but we didn't want to repeat some of the amazing documents that already exist. There's a whole manifesto around what we should do around the 1001 critical days. And as I say, Andrea covers that in detail as well. The all-party group has changed its name from ACEs to Adverse Childhood Experiences to try and sort of ensure that people understand, because if we all talk in acronyms, we never get anywhere. And it's one of those things that, I don't think my children were harmed or had any of these adverse childhood experiences, but as now a mother of children 25 and 27, I always say I wish I'd known more. Wish I'd known what I know now then. That's why I'm so excited about grandchildren, and maybe this is what all grandparents are like. So I think, and I've always said and touched on it during our evidence sessions, that this should be taught in schools in an age-appropriate way about the effect on brain development. And you can start when children are toddlers in nursery by saying, oh, the baby's crying, go and pick the baby up, and sort of beginning to sort of explain why that's important to nurture and to bond with the baby, right the way through to when they're teenagers, doing the science of it all with the brain development and how those adverse experiences can really damage the brain in a way that will make a person less empathetic. There's so many books being written on this. We could populate a whole curriculum. So that's
Sharon, I know you're in full flow.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I stop you there? Because
no,
that
was all I wanted to say.
That's a very good answer. Edward, just in brief, adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, grew up in a family who had it sort of happen in front of our eyes. So I don't need any convincing the importance of everyone, and not just early years professionals, people in schools, but right across agencies and in the community, understanding how this plays out for many people in their lives. And when I did a report, independent report for the government into school exclusion a few years ago, one of my key recommendations there was to ensure that in training and development, in some of the continued professional development as well, which we've got recommendations on in this manifesto, should have included in that trauma-informed, attachment-aware training, so that when a child is struggling or a family circumstance is difficult, people are able to answer the question why. What is causing that child's poor behaviour? What are the underlying reasons that they're really struggling? And more often than not, it's some sort of adverse experience they've had in their childhood that's playing out. So I think that has to be not just in this manifesto, but right across many other parts of the community and professionals who come into contact with children, so they really understand what it is that they're dealing with.
Thank you so much. There are several questions about parenting skills, and the report talks about support for parents. But there's one question, for example, by Norman Rimmel, who asks, do you agree there's a need to ensure all parents possess necessary parenting skills, and should remedial action be taken where this is not the case? So I'm going to ask first Robert and then Kate, how involved should the state be in intervening to ensure parents have parenting skills? Robert, would you go first, please?
Yes, thank you. I hope the sound is better now. I absolutely believe there needs to be intervention. I mean, the health visits is intervention. If you're saying the state will make 5 health visits or more, that is intervention. As I say, I think the intervention from very early years is incredibly important. Family hubs is positive intervention, because that helps the parent, mentors the parents, identify those parents with difficulties. The Troubled Families Programme, that's intervention. If schools do parental engagement programmes, or if that increases, as I mentioned, the model of Feltham Reach Academy, that is intervention. So I wouldn't regard this as some kind of Orwellian type intervention. I would regard it as positive intervention by the state for the welfare of its citizens, and something that we know will make a huge difference later on in that child's life.
Thank you. And Kate?
I'd just make a couple of points. First of all, this can't be something that's stigmatizing. It needs to be an offer to all parents, and many parents are very, very pleased to have the opportunity to take up the chance to develop their parenting skills. And I think it is important, therefore, that it's a universal offer. It's not that we single out certain parents and say your skills aren't good enough and you need to attend these classes. And I also think there's an immense amount to be gained by peer support. Parents want to be with other parents. They've done this without structures, and they can do it within structures, and family centres and so on are a great place for them to have the opportunity to do that. But parents want to hear from other parents, and I think we should be really supporting, as Sure Starts and family centres have been able to do, that interaction between parents.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about breastfeeding. Martina Donaghy, for example, asks, should there be extra funding for breastfeeding postnatal support? And she says the government needs to acknowledge the UK's very poor rates and the critical role breastfeeding has for child health and long-term development. Edward and then Sharon, could I ask you very briefly, should breastfeeding be a particular focus, or is it more general parenting support that you think is the priority?
Well, I've got four children, and if I was to give you my wife's experience of each and breastfeeding, it would be different on each occasion. I think that demonstrates that sort of continued sort of ability to access breastfeeding support is really important. And I haven't got the statistics to hand, but I think there's unfortunately sort of a sort of shift away from it, despite the natural nurturing element of breastfeeding. And this is why looking at not only the increased use of health visitors, but also going back to what Kate said about support within the community. I know the NCT and others have done great work in this regard. Those sort of networks we need to keep alive so that parents feel that they can access advice and guidance, so they don't miss out on the opportunity where it's available to them to bring up and nurture their child in that way.
Thank you. And Sharon, what's your view on this?
Oh, absolutely. You said briefly, so like Edward, I can't go into the detail that I absolutely love to on this question. I was evangelical about breastfeeding my own two. First one for 9 months, second one for 16 months, because she turned out to be lactose intolerant. So that's a whole other story. And honestly, I don't think I would have been as successful at it if I'd been in and out of hospital in the sort of same day or overnight as it is now. With my first, I was in for 5 nights, my second 3 nights. So I really worry about how young mums get breastfeeding established in families where there isn't a history of breastfeeding. My daughter won't be a problem. I'll be there with her every step of the way when she gets to that stage. But if you're from a non-breastfeeding family, as lots are, that's why our numbers are so bad, who gets you off to that good start? You get the parents, the grandparents saying to the new mum, oh, just give the baby a bottle, that's just too much trouble, look how sore you are. And they think they're helping, but it just perpetuates this lack of breastfeeding culture. Also role models, this is another thing very quickly. We need more people in the public eye to breastfeed, so young girls and women of all ages who are mothers see that it's cool and it's a good thing to do.
Right, lovely. There's several questions about the early years workforce, which is talked about in the report. I'd like to ask Robert and then Kate this question from Caroline Needham. She asks, how can young people be encouraged to aspire to a career as an early years educator? Robert, you talked about careers and it was part of your role in government. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, so I welcome that the government's created a 20 million early years professional development fund that, as I understand, it's going to be targeted towards the most disadvantaged areas. But that will fund just 3,000 practitioners. The way I see it, and I'm passionate about apprenticeships and skills, to encourage a workforce is to offer them apprenticeships. So they'll be able to earn while they learn. There's no student debt they have to take on. And if we can offer skilled apprenticeships from level 2 right up to degree level in early years and encourage early years providers to take them on, I think it would make a huge difference. We've argued in our White Working Class report that they should be teaching degree apprenticeships as well, because at the moment you can only do a postgraduate degree apprenticeship. And I think that would be a very exciting offering to young people and would expand the workforce if you showed them there was a apprenticeship progression or apprentices working their way up.
Thank you. Robert, we're still getting a little bit of feedback from your sound. We can hear you, but if you can do anything to try and speak closer to the mic, that would be great. But Kate, what's your thoughts on the early years workforce?
Yes, the early years workforce is an absolutely crucial element of the way in which we give the best start in life to very young children. And it's very important, therefore, that we do all that we can to make it a high status workforce of highly qualified, highly skilled professionals. And so I agree with Rob about, for example, routes through apprenticeships, high quality apprenticeships, and through degree level qualifications. I also think it's really important that we have to recognise that what draws people into a profession is pay and it is career prospects. Pay is low for early years professionals. We undervalue them. And I think we could do more. And some attempts have been made to do this, for example, with teaching assistants and with childminders, but a lot more could be done to help those who want to develop their careers to see those entry-level jobs that they may be undertaking in the early years sector as a stepping stone to gaining further professional qualifications and enlarging their career prospects and going on to develop to more senior and professional levels. So I think career pathways and progression pathways for the profession are very important. And in investing in professional development, something that Rob has alluded to, the government funding, and which is also in our recovery plan, I think we should be thinking very carefully about how that includes progressing those workers.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Vicky Nevin from the NSPCC, and she says the manifesto makes an important recommendation on a national strategy for the early years, but how do we ensure early years are prioritised across local government? And she asks whether a health and care bill, that the health and care bill before Parliament could be amended to ensure every local area has a strategy for infants and children. As the co-chairs, Edward and then Sharon, what do you think about how central government can make sure local government prioritises early years support and education?
I think one of the things we want to try and move away from as much as possible is this sort of firefighting sort of mentality in lots of the services that are interacting with very young children have, as you say, a more sort of a locally co-produced and cooperative way of ensuring that it's a child-centered system that's created at a local level. We're seeing through the Health and Social Care Bill the sort of development of these integrated care systems. When we look at the SEND reforms, every local area has to publish a local offer setting out what are the services available to children with special education needs and disabilities. So I think there is room here, and we talk about a parent support service in our manifesto, which gives a clear readout to parents what it is that is on offer in their local area and demonstrates that health, social care, education and other services are working together or coordinating that effort so that that sort of place-based approach and the needs of children locally are being matched by the services that are available.
Thank you. And Sharon?
Well, obviously, you're going to think she will say that, won't she? But it has to come down to funding. The central government has to fund local government properly to deliver these services. And as Edward says, give a local offer, say what should be the basic, the minimum. But, without the funds to do that, then local government are just firefighting, sadly. And there was something at the start of 2010 called the Early Intervention Grant that sort of pulled all these early intervention pots of money together. And, it was top sliced and wasn't as much as it could have been, but it was a pot of money local government got. That doesn't even exist now. We always said this money for early years, for early intervention should be ring fenced. It isn't, it wasn't, and we are where we are now. And the sad thing is, Sure Start was just beginning to bed in. We might have had 3,500 and we lost 1,000 of them, but But unless you were one of the people, that generation that got to use them, they hadn't even been in long enough. And even now we'll speak to some people and they haven't even heard of Sure Start. They don't even know what you're talking about. It would be like scrapping nursery before, nursery schools before nursery schools had a chance to bed in. So I really think early years has got to be prioritised and funded by central government.
Thank you very much. One of the interventions that the report talks about is the importance of health visitors. And we have a question from Emma Carey, who talks about a programme in Blackpool called Better Start. And she says health visiting takes into account the vulnerability of children and their needs by increasing access to health visitors and contact with them, but says nowhere else in the Northeast has this. I'd like to ask Kate and then Robert, should we see more investment in health visitors? Kate.
There are a number of programs, and the one that Emma's talking about sounds really interesting. And I think there's general acceptance that health visitors are a really important way of engaging with parents and having a very, very early process of ensuring that children's development proceeds well and that they thrive in the way that they need and should. So I absolutely see them as a core part of the way in which we support children and young people, very young children to develop. I have to say, the questions we're getting today are very, very health focused, and I'm quite interested in that because there is a bit, I'm here as the Shadow Education Secretary, Rob's the chair of the Education Select Committee, and I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is health visitors are going to be looking at the whole family. They're in the home, able to see every aspect of the way that the child is beginning their life at home. And so I do think it is important that if they're going to be the key worker interacting with the family in the home in those very, very early years, that they are seen as doing something broader than focusing purely on health. We're looking at the whole child here, and I think that's the great thing about some of these programs that have been developed, that they really are very holistic in the way that they think about the engagement with the family in those early years.
Thank you, Kate. And Robert? I think you're muted, Robert.
I think it's a no-brainer because I mentioned the Manchester City Council 8 visits. I've seen a constituency where our family hub, they do health visits to troubled families, and it makes a huge difference. And even in your report, you show that something like only 13% of local authorities can identify whether a child who missed their 2.5 years old, 2.5 years old review was also from a disadvantaged family. So it needs a radical overhaul. And we know, because you can identify families who are facing difficulties, facing problems, and then you can set out an intervention program for that family. So what the government should do is look at examples like Blackpool, like Manchester, and other areas of the country where this is working well, and try and implement a consistent regime working with local authorities to try and make this a reality across the board. I think that's what you say in your report.
Thank you, Robert. So I'd like to ask the co-chairs now about, we've talked about the role of central government, we've talked about the role of local government, but what about the voluntary and community sector? We have a question from Jo Bussey from the Hearts and Minds Partnership, which is a collaborative project of 3 perinatal mental health charities. And she asked specifically about the role of the voluntary sector in the context of mental health. But can you both talk, Edward and then Sharon, more broadly about the role you see for the voluntary sector in investment in the early years that you would like to see? Edward,
well,
first.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Well, I speak as someone who is patron of my local Home Start charity, who my mum, when she was alive, was a volunteer there when she finished fostering. And that's an excellent example of where a voluntary organisation which has a national sort of umbrella, but more importantly has a sort of a local sort of roots into the community, are helping families with young children who maybe be struggling with just the day-to-day demands of bringing up children, but there may be other underlying issues that they can also assist with. And for me, that's epitomises where the voluntary sector have an absolutely central role in providing some of that community support that we speak about in the manifesto, which at the moment, unfortunately, is too often undervalued by those who are making commissioning decisions, and also I have to say from sometimes from central government in the way that they then fund or provide opportunities for those sorts of organisations to really fuse into the local support that's on offer. So I would like to see, as we improve some of the data in the early years, is really understanding the impact of what these organisations are making for many children. And a good starting point is those who are on the call here is to if they do have any good information on where they can see that they have made a discernible difference to many children and families that they've had contact with in the early years, share that information with us, so us as parliamentarians can really push that agenda and ensure that there's a clear evidence base for the voluntary sector playing a more prominent and sustainable role in the future of the early years as we set out in our manifesto.
Thank you. And Sharon, can you tell us your view on the role of the voluntary and community sector?
Yeah, I mean, excellent work is done across the voluntary and community centre by so many committed and individuals and practitioners that we, can just not do without, frankly. But this should be additional. It should never be instead of statutory provision, which I fear at the moment all too often it is. And so these services are so stretched, and then the public then sort of get frustrated with the services that are actually being provided by the voluntary community sector, rather than sort of, in my opinion, being shown that frustration in the right direction, which should be at central government for not ensuring that there is statutory provision for all of this. All of the work that these great people do in the voluntary community sector should be additional. That is the point that I really want to make.
Thank you so much. We've had lots of great questions coming in. I'm just going to do one final round now with the panel, because there's lots of questions that ask basically what now. And so Panima Tanuku, who's from the National Day Nurseries Association, she says she fully endorses these priorities, and she says, how confident are you that this work will be taken seriously by government and the recommendations are accepted and enacted? So in reverse order to our speakers, I'd like to ask Kate, then Robert, then Sharon, and then Edward, what happens now? And I'd like you to be very specific about what you will do in your role to take forward the work that's contained in this manifesto. So Kate, you first. What's the Labour Party going to do about this?
We're expecting a spending review later this year. The job of the Labour Party will be to challenge the Chancellor and all Secretaries of State to put in place the investment that is needed to deliver the very best outcomes for very young children. And that will be my job in the coming months.
Thank you very much. So Robert, both as Chair of the Select Committee, but as respected backbencher, what will you do to take this forward?
Well, we've already been taking some of these proposals forward even before the report was published in the Select Committee reports that we've done, one on early years, one on white working class pupils, and we'll continue to campaign on those issues, particularly the family hubs, which I think is incredibly important, and also the health visitors, which we've talked about during this session. We will be holding accountability meetings with ministers. No doubt some of these recommendations will feature in future reports that we do. And the role of Select Committee is to campaign and be a powerhouse of ideas, and we'll continue to try and do that with all my committee colleagues as much as possible.
Thank you very much. Sharon?
In my current role, as you said, I'm currently PPS to Keir Starmer, so obviously support everything Kate said with regard to what Labour will be doing, but in my role, I'll be, Keir has said, as you know, Keir Starmer said, as you know, he wants the UK to be the best place in the world for a child to grow up in. So I'll be holding him to that and reminding him of those words with a copy of this manifesto in my hand, and to basically say, this is the blueprint, this is how we make it happen.
Thank you very much. And Edward?
Well, I was driven into politics for a number of reasons, some of it by accident rather than by design, but the golden thread through it all for me has been championing the cause of children, particularly the most disadvantaged and those who are falling behind and not reaching their potential. And that remains my mission. That's why I came back to Parliament, and I have the glorious freedom of the backbenches to make that case as strongly as I can. But we do have now the government's commitment through the Ledson review, and following that through, which we saw in the Queen's speech. So I think there is some building blocks there that we can now try and use this manifesto as taking it to the next step. And for me, that will be brokering meetings with the key departments, ministers, secretaries of state, continuing to raise it in Parliament, but also importantly at local level, and talking and encouraging other members of Parliament and local leaders to really think carefully about how they can start to engineer some of this change themselves without relying on necessarily a new piece of law or change in regulation or whatever it may be, because actually a lot of the power to make this change is already available to us. And so being able to work with people, encourage them, give them the confidence to make some of those changes will make a big difference. But ultimately, it will be banging the drum for the early years for the foreseeable future until we start to see some of these really important changes come into reality.
Thank you very much. All our panel have been admirably concise there. So to sum up, I'd like to echo the thanks to the Centre for Social Justice and to the Fabian Society for coming together in this admirable way to exemplify the cross-party approach that I think we all agree is needed if we are to see sustained investment in early years education and support. And in their joint introduction, Sharon and Edward said one thing which struck me. They said, having acted as minister and shadow minister for children and families, it was clear, even when facing each other across the dispatch box, we both agreed on the fundamental importance of this issue. And that seemed to me to capture the spirit of what this commission set out to achieve, the mood we've had today, the mood that you, the audience, have taken forward with many probing but very, very excellent and thoughtful questions. So please remember to keep the conversation going on social media. Use the hashtag Early Years Manifesto. And thank you again for all of our panel, to Kate Green, the Shadow Education Secretary, to Robert Halfon, the Chair of the Education Select Committee, to Sharon Hodgson, our PPS, to Keir Starmer, and to Edward Timpson, Member of Parliament. And do please read this excellent report and keep the work going. Thank you all to you for watching. Goodbye.